Forget the Sunday school stories. This was a high-stakes political assassination, a rigged trial, and a betrayal worth 30 pieces of silver. This is the truth about the 7 days that ended a man but started an era. Human history is a brutal torrent where thousands of empires have risen only to crumble into the dust of oblivion. But have you ever stopped to wonder why our entire modern civilization is governed by a single solitary point in time? Whenever you glance at a calendar on the wall, sign a legal contract, or celebrate a birthday, you are unconsciously bowing before the shadows and the light of the bloodiest week to ever take place. 2,000 years ago, it took exactly 7 days. 7 days for a penniless carpenter from the remote region of Galilee to topple the power structures of the mighty Roman Empire and shatter the eardrums of the most influential religious elite. Those 7 days did not merely reshape a faith. They cleaved the very flow of universal time into before and after. However, what you may have heard in classrooms or seen in fleeting Hollywood films is often just a romanticized shell. The hidden truth behind those 7 days is a terrifying political chess match, a meticulously orchestrated death sentence, and a series of harrowing psychological battles that far exceed any human imagination. What truly happened in the darkness of that fateful week? Why did the thunderous cheers of the masses turn into bloodthirsty screams for execution in the blink of an eye? I urge you to stay until the final seconds of this video, because the sensational historical mysteries we are about to uncover will ensure you never look at the cross the same way again. If you are passionate about digging deep into the invisible corners of history and spirituality, do not hesitate to hit the subscribe button to motivate us to produce even more valuable films. This is Grace, and I welcome you all. Let us journey back in time, returning to a Sunday that was drenched in sunlight, yet suffocating with the scent of imminent riot in Jerusalem. That day, history remembers as Palm Sunday. The air in Jerusalem was thick with dust, the sour stench of sweat, and the suppressed rage of a people living for decades under the iron heel of the Roman legions. Thousands of people poured into the streets, waving fresh palm branches and shouting cries of acclamation with a desperate, almost manic longing. The scene appeared as a magnificent epic, but looking deep into the eyes of the crowd at that moment, I see only a profound and fractured psychological disconnect. What was this crowd actually waiting for? They were thirsting for a military tyrant. They craved a reincarnation of King David, a legendary leader who would ride in on a fiery warhorse, wielding a razor-sharp sword to bathe the Roman Caesars in blood and restore earthly glory to the kingdom of Israel. They cheered for this man because they were certain that the hour of a bloody armed revolution had finally struck. Yet, the Messiah did not bring a kingdom built on swords and corpses. His quiet choice to ride upon the back of a young donkey, an absolute symbol of humility and peace in ancient Near Eastern culture, was a bucket of ice water splashed directly onto the flames of the crowd's delusions. It was a sharp, defiant declaration that his kingdom did not belong to this world. His revolution was the overturning of the arrogant strongholds within the human heart and soul. This fatal mismatch was the first spark. When earthly expectations of a war of liberation are cruelly extinguished, extreme adoration quickly ferments into extreme resentment, paving the way for the tragedy at the end of the week. If Sunday was merely a disillusionment, then the events of Monday and Tuesday were a direct declaration of war, igniting a ticking time bomb at the very heart of power. When Jesus stepped foot into the Temple of Jerusalem, he did not enter a quiet sanctuary of faith. He was venturing into the busiest financial and political hub of the first century, a Wall Street of antiquity, monopolized by a religious elite led by the family of the high priest Annas. Millions of poor pilgrims traveling from afar brought their sincere devotion, only to be crushed by the Sanhedrin's monopolistic system. They forced the people to buy sacrificial animals at exorbitant prices. They coerced them into exchanging Roman currency for the temple's own coinage at exchange rates that were nothing short of daylight robbery. A sacred place of worship had been transformed into a money-printing machine, wringing the blood, sweat, and tears from the most destitute. The moment Jesus braided a whip of cords, his veins bulging as he flipped over heavy oak tables laden with silver coins and liberated thousands of sacrificial animals, it was not a moment of impulsive loss of control. It was a calculated strategic strike aimed directly at the economic jugular of an entire corrupt system. He publicly slapped the face of the Jewish leadership's power, disrupting their cash flow. This act officially rendered him an existential threat that could no longer be tolerated. The gears of death had begun to grind, and the death sentence was effectively signed. The very second those soulless silver coins went clattering across the cold marble floor of the temple. The metallic clinking of cold silver coins hitting the temple floor had barely faded before the shadows of betrayal and utter loneliness began to creep into the very midst of his inner circle. As the darkness of Thursday descended, cloaking the conspiracies simmering within the palatial estates of the priests, Jesus and his 12 disciples retreated to an upper room to partake in the Passover meal. However, this was no victory banquet or strategic council to plot an armed insurrection, as the disciples were still deluding themselves to believe. The atmosphere was thick with a heavy, stifling sorrow, a haunting prophecy of the death that loomed just around the corner. Within that room, history witnessed one of the most shocking subversions of the power hierarchy. The Messiah, the man the crowds had hailed as the King of Kings just days prior, stripped off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, and knelt to wash the feet of each disciple. In ancient society, this was the most menial task imaginable, reserved exclusively for the lowest foreign slaves. That act was not merely a cliché moral lesson on service. It was a blade that severed every human preconception of power. He was stripping away human arrogance, declaring that true sovereignty does not lie in ruling through imposition, but in sacrificing oneself to the very fringes of humility. But the true psychological tragedy did not unfold at the dinner table. It exploded when the darkness swallowed the Garden of Gethsemane. If you want to see the humanity of Jesus revealed in its most authentic, violent, and agonizing form, look into the black night of this olive-shaded grove. He did not walk toward his death with the serene smile of a philosopher indifferent to pain, nor did he strike the pose of a mythical hero immune to fear. He entered the fray with a paralyzing terror and horror that numbed every sense. The scriptures record that his sweat fell like great drops of blood hitting the ground. From a medical perspective, this is the phenomenon of hematidrosis, a rare condition that occurs only when an individual is subjected to extreme neurological stress and psychological pressure, causing the capillaries to rupture and blood to hemorrhage into the sweat glands. What was he so afraid of that his body reacted with such violence? It was not merely the dread of the physical scourging or the jagged wooden cross that awaited him. The invisible pressure crushing his mind was the colossal weight of the entire collective sin, corruption, hatred, and filth of human history, stretching from the past to the infinite future, all of which was about to be poured directly onto the bleeding shoulders of an innocent man. In that very moment of life and death, as his soul writhed in a psychological death throes, those who had sworn to live and die with him fell into a deep sleep. The loneliness of Jesus at this hour was absolute. Not a single spark of understanding. Not a single hand held in empathy. He was left entirely alone, suspended between the judgment of a righteous God and the heartless indifference of the very humanity he was about to bleed to redeem. The prayer, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done," was the greatest roar of submission ever uttered. It tore through the night and slammed shut every door of retreat. He had manually signed his own death warrant, even before the traitor ever appeared. At this point, we must look at the garden not just as a geographical location, but as a battlefield of the will. While the world slept, the cosmic pivot of history was turning on the axis of a single man's agony. The silence of Gethsemane was a deafening indictment of human frailty. Every time we choose the path of least resistance or turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, we echo the slumber of those disciples. But Jesus' refusal to flee, his choice to remain in the path of the oncoming storm, redefined the very essence of courage. It was a courage born not from the absence of fear, but from a deliberate, agonizing commitment to a purpose greater than self-preservation. As the torches of the temple guard began to flicker in the distance, casting long, dancing shadows against the ancient olive trees, the psychological battle ended. The inner victory was won in the blood-stained soil of the garden, long before the physical battle began on the hill of the skull. The man who stood up to meet his captors was no longer a victim of fate, but the master of it. The haunting silence of the Garden of Gethsemane was suddenly shattered by the glare of burning torches, the clanking of swords and spears, and the rhythmic, heavy thud of the temple guard's footsteps. Out of the darkness, Judas Iscariot stepped forward, and history forever recorded one of the most brutal paradoxes of humanity: a kiss used as a weapon of execution. Why a kiss? In ancient Jewish culture, a disciple's kiss for his teacher was the ultimate sacred symbol of reverence, bond, and brotherly love. But Judas transformed the most radiant symbol of love into the coldest signaling device for a killing machine. This act stripped bare the ultimate corruption of man, a place where deceit is perfectly camouflaged under the veneer of intimacy. The moment the traitor's lips touched the cheek of Jesus, it was not just the betrayal of an individual. It was a vivid portrait of a humanity ready to sell its conscience and the truth for a mere 30 pieces of silver, a paltry price equivalent to the compensation for a slave gored to death by an ox in that era. Immediately following that fateful kiss, the gears of injustice began to grind away all legal principles. Jesus was hauled away in the dead of night, marking the beginning of 6 consecutive trials that took place in a whirlwind from midnight until dawn. From a historical and legalistic perspective, this entire trial process was a flagrant violation of the very Sanhedrin laws that the religious elite so proudly upheld. According to the law, no capital trial was permitted to occur at night. No death sentence could be pronounced on the same day as the trial. And most importantly, No testimony could be admitted if the witnesses contradicted one another. Yet, at the palace of the high priest Caiaphas, every rule was bent to make room for hatred. Were they seeking the truth? No, they were seeking a pretext. They desperately cobbled together the forged testimonies of bribed men, but all crumbled before the commanding silence of the man who stood like a king before a pack of hungry wolves. It was only when Caiaphas invoked a sacred oath to force him to confirm his identity as the Christ that the sentence was finally nailed down with the charge of blasphemy. The religious leadership was satisfied, but they lacked the legal authority to execute toward. They needed a Roman sword. The scene immediately shifted to the headquarters of the governor, Pontius Pilate, where another ruthless political drama was unveiled. Pilate was no naive puppet. He was a seasoned, cynical politician, cunning enough to see right through the base envy of the Jewish authorities. Upon interrogation, Pilate knew perfectly well that Jesus was innocent under Roman law. He was not inciting a revolt. He was not forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar, but caught between his conscience and the stability of his political seat, threatened by the risk of a riot from the crowd screaming, "Crucify him!" Pilate chose cowardice. He called for water to wash his hands, a symbolic act intended to cleanse himself of the responsibility for innocent blood. But water cannot wash away history. The thunderous roar of "Release Barabbas! Crucify Jesus!" From the crowd, the very people who might have been waving palm branches in his honor just days before, was the pinnacle of the psychological disconnect mentioned earlier. They preferred a rebel, a cold-blooded killer who had actually caused a riot, rather than tolerate a savior who dared to expose the sins hidden deep within their souls. Truth was traded for political compromise, clearing the path for the bloodiest execution in history to take place on the Hill of the Skull. This trial was not just a historical event, it was the ultimate trial of the human heart. It forced every player, from the high priest to the Roman governor to the common man in the crowd, to choose between their self-interest and the uncomfortable demands of the truth. Caiaphas chose his religious monopoly. Pilate chose his political career. The crowd chose their nationalistic illusions. In the face of an innocent man, the entire system revealed its inherent rot. As Jesus was led away, mocked and beaten, the justice of the world had officially failed. The only thing remaining was the cold, hard reality of the cross, a destination that had been inevitable since the first palm branch was laid on the dusty road to Jerusalem. The bloodthirsty cheers demanding the release of Barabbas had not yet faded before the death sentence was coldly handed down, clearing the way for the most agonizing journey a human being could ever endure on the path known as the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. What followed was not a heroic cinematic sequence with glowing halos as often depicted through the lens of romanticized art. It was the operation of a machine of torture and execution, meticulously designed by the Roman Empire with a morbid degree of sophistication to maximize pain and absolute humiliation. Before being forced to heave the weight of a wooden crossbar weighing dozens of kilograms, Jesus' body had already been pulverized by the flagrum, the Roman scourge. These leather whips, braided with jagged sheep bones and heavy lead balls, repeatedly lashed down, tearing away strips of flesh, rupturing capillaries, and exposing raw muscle and rib bone in a bloody mess. Each stroke was a shock of blood loss that drained his vitality, plunging his body into a state of severe hypovolemic shock before he even reached the destination. At the end of that road lay Golgotha, the hill of the skull, a barren limestone mound reeking of the stench of rotting corpses picked apart by crows. Crucifixion was not simply the act of hanging a man up. The executioners drove thick, tapered iron spikes through the wrists, the site of the median nerve, one of the most sensitive parts of the human body. When the cross was hoisted upright and dropped heavily into its socket, the entire weight of the body was jerked downward, tearing at the nerves and sending searing, electric-like jolts of pain from the arms to the brain. But the true brutality of this punishment lay in its mechanism of slow suffocation. In order to inhale, the victim was forced to push upward, bracing against the spike driven through both feet to lift the chest cavity. Every single breath was an agonizing cycle of self-torture, as the raw back, shredded by the scourging, was scraped against the coarse, splintered wood. Every exhale was a collapse of the body from sheer exhaustion. It was an excruciating loop of pain just to snatch a few inches of oxygen. This agony could last for days, turning the victim into a gruesome billboard displaying the absolute chilling power of Rome. Yet this horrific physical pain was merely the surface of a much deeper supernatural tragedy. At noon, a thick, anomalous darkness suddenly blanketed the entire land. This was not a natural solar eclipse, but the shadow of naked judgment. At that very moment, a soul-wrenching cry pierced the eerie silence. My God, why have you forsaken me?" For the first time in the infinite span of the spiritual realm, the perfect unity between God the Father and God the Son was torn asunder. Jesus was not merely dying as a political prisoner. He was being transformed into the embodiment of impurity, bearing the full weight of divine wrath for sins he never committed. He was rejected so that humanity would never have to endure that rejection again. When his final breath was spent, the declaration, "It is finished," was not the whimper of a defeated man giving up. It was the victory roar of a general who had just shattered the gates of a prison. Instantly, the massive veil shielding the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem was torn in two from top to bottom, a thunderous sign that permanently dismantled the corrupt religious system and removed every barrier separating sinful man from the presence of God. This moment on Golgotha was the ultimate paradox of history. At the very point where evil seemed to have won its greatest victory, it suffered its most crushing defeat. The cross, intended by Rome to be a symbol of shame and ultimate suppression, was transformed in that final breath into a throne of grace. The blood that soaked the dust of the hill of the skull did not cry out for vengeance like the blood of Abel, but for mercy. As the centurion standing guard looked up at the lifeless body, he voiced the realization that would eventually ripple through the centuries. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The darkness of Friday was absolute, but it was a darkness pregnant with a light that the world had never before seen. When the lifeless, blood-stained body was lowered from the cross and entombed in the cold darkness of a stone sepulchre, a suffocating silence descended upon all of Jerusalem. Saturday passed in a state of ultimate despair. The disciples, who had once brandished swords and sworn to protect their teacher unto death, were now nothing more than ghosts hiding in dark upper rooms, trembling in absolute terror at the prospect of Roman blades finding their throats next. Every hope for a new kingdom had died. Every promise of a Messiah seemed buried forever beneath a multi-ton ceiling stone and the strict guard of elite Roman legionnaires. Earthly power smiled in triumph once again, believing it had crushed a threat and extinguished a flickering fire of rebellion. However, human history could never have anticipated what was about to unfold at the sun-drenched dawn of Sunday. The violent earthquake that shook the tomb site at daybreak did more than just roll a massive stone aside. It permanently upended the intellectual order of entire human civilizations. The empty tomb was not a myth woven by fanciful minds. Consider the historical evidence, which is as heavy as it is incidental. In the ancient Jewish society of that era, where the testimony of women was considered legally worthless, the fact that the original records insisted on placing women like Mary Magdalene in the position of the first witnesses to the resurrection is madness. If the story were a fabrication, no deceiver in the first century would be foolish enough to use invalid witnesses to bolster the greatest lie of their life. The truth is, they simply recorded exactly what had actually happened, regardless of the risks to their credibility. Even more astounding was the inexplicable psychological transformation of the 11 remaining disciples. How could a group of cowardly, uneducated fishermen, who just days prior had abandoned their teacher to flee for their lives, suddenly step into the light? How could they boldly stand before the very powers that had ordered the execution of Jesus and accept beatings, torture, stoning, and being crucified upside down, yet refuse to retract their statement that he has risen? No one is willing to be martyred for a lie that they themselves know to be a hoax. Only a truly cataclysmic event, a raw contact with the resurrected one in flesh and bone, possessed the power to ignite the flame that turned cowards into the immortal warriors of faith. That event truly cleaved the flow of universal time. The tyrannical Roman power, with its invincible legions, eventually crumbled into the ashes of the past. The grand temples of pagan gods became ruins. Yet, the name of a poor carpenter from Nazareth has transcended thousands of years of history, reshaping every core value of morality, compassion, and human equality. Those 7 horrific days in Jerusalem 2 millennia ago are not merely a chronicle sitting quietly in a library. They are the sharpest spiritual wake-up call. When you look deep into that inanimate cross, you are not looking at the symbol of a dead religion. You are facing the greatest evidence of a love that dared to trade blood, life, and judgment itself for the freedom of your soul. The choice, from this moment on, lies entirely in your hands. This resurrection did not just change the fate of a few men in Judea, it redefined the trajectory of the human race. It introduced a new logic into history, that life comes through death, that greatness is found in service, and that the ultimate enemy, death itself, has been defeated. The empty tomb stands as a silent but deafening monument to the fact that the physical world is not all there is. As the light of that first Easter morning spilled over the hills of Jerusalem, it began a slow, unstoppable dawn that would eventually reach every corner of the globe. The story of the Holy Week is the story of the world being reborn. A narrative that continues to invite every person to step out of their own Saturday of despair and into the Sunday of an eternal living hope. Conclusion: the grand finale of redemption. The journey from the hushed atmosphere of the upper room during the Last Supper to the earth-shattering dawn at the empty tomb is more than just a sequence of tragic historical events. It is the greatest epic of redemption and unconditional love ever told. These 7 days in Jerusalem stripped human nature down to its barest form, exposing the fragility, betrayal, greed, and cowardice that reside within us all. From the deceitful kiss of Judas and the ruthless political compromise of Pilate to the bloodthirsty roar of the manipulated crowd, we see a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the human soul. Yet, standing in stark contrast to this backdrop of darkness is the absolute obedience and magnificent sacrifice of Jesus. The cross at Golgotha was not the finish line of a failed ideal, but the very place where darkness was defeated and the debt of humanity was paid in full by innocent blood. The sun of the resurrection morning permanently shattered the chains of death, transforming profound despair into eternal hope. This story transcends the boundaries of space and time to deliver a staggering message. True power does not lie in domination or violence, but is hidden within humility and the capacity to sacrifice for others. The resurrection serves as a living testimony that the light of truth can never be extinguished, offering a universal invitation for each of us to look inward and embrace the most profound spiritual transformation. Profound lessons and life applications. 1. The power of humility and servant leadership. The act of washing the disciples' feet overturned every worldly definition of power. In our modern lives and careers, instead of using authority to impose or manipulate, we should learn to become servant leaders. True respect is not demanded. It is earned by your willingness to stoop down, listen, and support those around you, whether they are your employees, colleagues, or family members. Leadership is not about being served, but about how many people you have genuinely served. 2. Guarding conscience against temptation and peer pressure. The betrayal of Judas for 30 pieces of silver and Pilate's cowardly washing of hands to protect his career serve as grave warnings about the cost of compromise. In an era of fierce competition, it is easy to sell out our moral values, honesty, or integrity for material gain or to please the majority. We must cultivate the courage to say no to wrongdoing and remain steadfast in protecting our truth and conscience, even when faced with personal disadvantage or social isolation. 3. Hope always exists after the darkest valleys. The suffocating silence of Saturday and the explosive victory of Sunday remind us that no pain, failure, or ultimate adversity is ever the final chapter. When you face crises that seem to shatter your will, whether it is job loss, bankruptcy, or a broken relationship, remember that the empty tomb represents new beginnings. Be patient, hold on to your faith, and allow yourself the grace to heal, knowing that the darkest night is often the precursor to the most brilliant dawn. Discussion questions and call to action. In the entire journey of the final 7 days of Jesus, from the intimacy of the Last Supper to the glory of the resurrection morning, which specific detail or event moved you the most or left the deepest impression on your mind? Was it the agonizing sweat like blood in the garden, the silent strength during the trials, or perhaps the transformation of the disciples? We invite you to share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments section below so we can explore these profound meanings together. If you found this content meaningful and thought-provoking, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and share this video or article with others. Your support is the greatest motivation for us to continue investing in and producing even more deep, high-quality content in the future. We sincerely thank you for being part of this journey.